Hello guys, welcome to episode 6 of this Vue tutorial where we are developing a full CRUD application. So far we have successfully implemented the add employee feature, the edit employee feature, the employee list feature. We haven't talked about deleting an employee yet, but we will discuss that. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about Pinia and state management. So I don't know whether, for example, if you have used React, you know that, for example, using Redux, you can do state management in React. In Vue, Pinia is one option for centralized state management. I'm going to talk about state management a little bit. I'm going to install Pinia and I'm going to show you how we can, use Pinia for state management. But first, I want to talk a little bit about components. If you have watched the previous episodes, you kind of probably noticed that we haven't created any components yet. So if I take you to my application, you see that we have no components, but we have views. So we have 3 different views, but no components. I discussed the differences between views and components in episode 2, I guess. But we will create components. I mean, in future episodes, little by little, we will extract some, common code between, for example, add and delete, add employee and delete employee page, and we'll introduce components. But back to the note. So far, our app kept everything inside views. Home view, add employee view, edit employee view, mainly for simplicity and focus. We wanted to start with core concepts, right? Like routing, props, API calls. The app is small, so no UI parts are reused across pages yet. So splitting into components wasn't urgent. But of course, we want a modular architecture, so we will introduce components little by little. But in real-world applications, we basically, use reusable components. So in production apps, you want to organize your UI into reusable, manageable, modular, components. For example, employee list component, employee form component, employee card component, and then you will be able to reuse these components inside of your application, inside of the pages of your application. So a page can be composed of many different components. Next step for us in this case is adding Pinia for state management. Pinia is the modern recommended, state management library for Vue and the official successor to Vuex. Now, let's talk about Pinia. Pinia is much simpler, and the syntax for writing code with Pinia is, very clean. It, of course, supports TypeScript out of the box. It has better DevTools integration with your browser, and you need less boilerplate code. But before we talk about Pinia, let's talk a little bit about state management. What is state management? So state basically means the data that your application has and maintains in the front end, for example. So the collection of all the, let's say, values inside of the, properties or variables, altogether they create or they give you the state of your application, and you need to manage that state. So this is called state management. So in a Vue application, a state refers to the data that your app uses. Like, for example, a list of employees, the user logging status, or a selected item. These are pieces of information, pieces of data that your app needs to manage. So your app does that through state management. When your app gets bigger, sharing that data across multiple components becomes challenging. That's where state management comes in. So this is a very important thing, I guess. So with smaller applications, maybe you even don't need to have state management. But when the app gets larger and more complex, when you introduce more components and pages inside of your application, then more often than not, you need to share data across those, components, across those pages. In that case, you need a solid, robust state management solution. And Pinia in Vue applications is the answer. So why do we need state management again? So imagine you fetch a list of employees, like what we have achieved so far, in one component. Right now we are fetching the list of employees, and we're showing that list inside of the home page. Home page, right? It's a page, right? So you want to display the same list in different component. You don't want to fetch that list again. This list of employees is a piece of information. It's data that your app requires and your app needs to manage. Or update an employee from a form and reflect the change elsewhere. So passing data through multiple components manually using props and events becomes messy and hard to maintain, especially when your application grows in size and complexity. But with a solution like, for example, Pinia, for state management, everything is centralized. So you're going to have a store, this is called a store, a centralized place, right, to maintain or keep your data and to update that data. And then different parts of your application, different pages, different components can use the data you are maintaining inside of that store. So that ensures that your data is consistent everywhere and all parts of your app react when the data changes. And you do not need to do a lot of things manually by, passing props here and there, because everything is being managed in a centralized approach using your estate management solution. Pinia. Pinia is the estate management library that we're going to use in this tutorial. So it is the official recommended way to manage estate in Vue. It replaced the older Vuex with a cleaner, more robust and modern API. Benefits of using Pinia. Simplicity. It is very easy to learn with minimal boilerplate, especially if you have some experience in other, let's say frameworks or libraries, like for example, Redux in React. It is easy to learn, minimal boilerplate code, reactive out of the box, so it works seamlessly with reactivity in Vue. It is modular, so you can define multiple stores. Stores are those central places where you keep your data, where you manage your data, and then you provide the components and the pages of your application with those pieces of information or data. So you define multiple stores for different parts of your app. DevTools integration, you can easily inspect and debug your state easily. TypeScript ready, it supports TypeScript out of the box. Right now in our application, we have been using JavaScript. But of course, in Vue, you can also use TypeScript, so full support for type, state, and actions. What are we going to do in this video? We're going to install Pinia. We're going to create a centralized store, right? Use employee store. And then we're going to move all of our API calls into that store. Right now, our API calls are scattered in our pages. For example, inside of home view, if you take a look, I am deleting an employee. I am fetching, employees. And in edit, again, I am fetching one single employee. I am updating employees, right? So I want these API calls to be maintained inside of a centralized place, a store. So we're going to move all of those API calls into the store that we're going to create, and then we're going to refactor our views to use that centralized store instead of repeating the API logic, here and there. So the first step, as I told you, is to install Pinia. This is the way you install Pinia inside of your application. It's a dependency, npm install Pinia. Let me do this. So inside of my application, I'm going to create a new tab. And then I'm going to install Pinia. So the next step is to register Pinia in main.js. So this is, the way you register Pinia. You are registering your routes, right? We have defined our routes inside of that index.js file in the router folder. And then we need to import create Pinia from Pinia, and we need to use create Pinia like this. So take a look here. Inside of the router, you're creating your routes here. And then in main.js, you're using routes using use.router. You're importing your router here. Now I'm going to get rid of this, and then I'm going to write the code to not only use the routes, but also use Pinia. Create Pinia. And then let's create the app. the application is going to use router, the application is going to use Pinia, and then the application is going to mount on that, div element with this ID. And by the way, I noticed something inside of the home, page. Let me close out this. We have the delete employee as well here. I forgot to talk about this, by the way. I'm not sure. I guess so. So the button, right? When you click this, is gonna, invoke that delete employee function with the employee ID, and then it's gonna send the delete request to our backend API, right? And then it's gonna fetch the employees again. So that means that, for example, if I come here, right, and click on Bob, leader designer, I'm gonna remove, Bob from the home page, or let's say from the backend API. But as I told you, the API communication logic is scattered, inside of the different pages that we have right now. I don't like that. I want a centralized place, a store. Now that I have installed Pinia, I want to centralize the store to keep the logic for, this API communication thing, and then my components can have access to that state. So then we are going to create the store. So we're going to create this folder, and then we are going to create this file, employee.js, inside of stores. And then you can, define your store. You're importing define store from Pinia, right? You're importing Axios, and then take a look here. You are creating different actions for different, let's say operations that you have for communicating with the backend. So for example, fetch employees, add employee, delete employee, fetch employee by ID, update employee. These are all the actions that your store provides, and your components, your pages, can use these actions to communicate with the backend. And then we have, let's say, we have chosen the name employee for the estate, for the store. And if you take a look, we have, created an initial state for this employee store. So the initial state is an empty array called employees, and then selected employee, which is null at first. This selected employee is, of course, the employee that is going to be updated or delete or edited, for example. This is, again, very similar to what Redux helps us achieve in React applications. Anyways, let's develop this. Let's create this. So inside of my application, I am going to create another folder here. It is called stores, and employee.js is going to be the name of this store, employee.js. And then here, what I want to do is to create the store. So I'm going to import define store. I'm going to import Axios. I'm going to create my store, use employee store. The name is employee, the initial state, an empty array, selected employees null, and then all the actions. We're already familiar with these actions. Fetch employees is going to, I get employees from the backend, add employee, add one employee to the backend, delete employee based on the ID of that employee, and then fetch employee by ID, get the information of one employee based on the ID, and finally update employee, which will update the employee based on the ID of that employee and the data that it takes in. So this is the store that we have right now. In the note here, I have talked about this, so we can kind of discuss what is happening here. So first, define store. This function creates a Pinia store, a centralized place. We talked about store. It's a centralized place to hold reactive state and related logic. The first argument, employee, is the unique name of this store. The second argument is an object containing the store's state and actions. Right now, take a look here. This is the name, and the second argument is an object that contains the state and the actions. The state right now has been set to an object itself, an object with two keys. the employees, like an empty array, and selected employee, which is null right now. And then the actions is going to be an object containing different, functions for communicating with that backend. So yeah, this is the state. The state is a function returning an object. It defines the reactive data properties managed by the store. Employees is an array that will hold a list of employee objects, and selected employee holds the data for a single employee. For example, the one being viewed or edited. This state is reactive. So when you update these properties, any component using this store will automatically update. So the state of your application is managed in a centralized place right now, in one store that your application had. Then the actions. So actions are methods defined inside of your store that contain business logic. So the operations that, for example, read or update state and perform side effects, like, for example, API calls. Each action here is an asynchronous function interacting with a REST API. Exactly. So these actions are asynchronous functions, right, interacting with our backend API. Now, for example, the fetch employees action. It makes a GET request to fetch all employees, and then it updates the reactive employees array with the fetch data. You remember these employees inside of the state of this store? It's going to update that, employees array with the data it receives from the backend. So take a look here. This employees refers to this array. So whenever you get something from the backend, you're going to update your state. The same thing happens for the other, actions as well. Add employee, right, is going to send a post request to add a new employee using the data that it receives as the payload. This is the employee which we want to add. And then fetch employees. Fetch employees is the other action that we, invoke again after we have added an employee, because we want to update the employees array, which is a state inside of our, store. So fetch employees. We're going to call fetch employees after we have added, an employee to refresh the employee list in the store, right? The next one is delete employee. Again, it sends a delete request to remove an employee from the backend using the ID of that employee. And then again, it calls fetch employees action to refresh the data inside of the employee list. Fetch employee by ID is going to take in an ID, is going to send a GET request to the backend using the ID of that employee, and it's going to set the selected employee state to the data it receives. Take a look here. We've got this employees array and we've got selected employee set to null. When we fetch an employee by ID, we are going to set the selected employee state to the data that this operation returns. So retrieve the single employee data by their ID and updates the reactive selected employee state, useful for forms and details view. Update employee takes in two parameters, ID and updated employee. So this is going to, send a put request to this ID of that employee that we want to update, and the new, payload or the new values for that single employee. And after it has done that, update thing, it's going to fetch the employees one more time to update that employee list. So with this design, the data that the application manages, the state, as well as the logic that works with that data is centralized, has been put to one single place, the store, right? And this makes the application easier to manage, especially when the application grows in size and when your components need to access these different pieces of information. So instead of, having API integration logic repeated throughout your components or pages, now you have one centralized place to, manage your state and to communicate with the backend. And now your components can use that store to kind of reflect the state of your application. This is the setup that we have right now, but the application is not using this store right now, right? In the future episodes, what we are going to do is to actually use this store, this employee store, in the components and views that the application has. So that's the topic of the future episodes. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. And if that's the case, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and I will see you in the next one.